So last round, Chicago Open, I lost the last game, which was disappointing, but I felt like it's still a very, very decent tournament. And if I can win the last one to finish it off, then I think it kind of caps off a very, very solid performance. If I don't win the last one, then that kind of smarts and yeah, would put a bit of doubt onto the tournament. But I'm paired against National Master Caleb Denby, who's a friend of the dojo, a fellow streamer for the St. Louis Chess Club. And yeah, I don't think there was a lot of time to prepare for this game because this was like the last final Sunday, like 4:30 p.m. round. So we both kind of showed up to the to the board, I think, without having done a ton of prep. I ended up starting with d4. It was knight of 6, e4, e6. And here I opted to play bishop f4, which is actually a move I've played once recently, and I feel like it's kind of an interesting way to approach this classic position where, of course, white can play for the Nimzo-Indian or play knight f3. With bishop f4, the idea is to just kind of mix up the move order, make it not so simple for black, and kind of force them to think on their own right in the opening. So he ends up playing d5, which is one of several very, very solid moves. You know, bishop b4 check is okay, b6 is also okay. Black can even play c5, but then at least white will go d5 and we'll get some kind of weird Benoni type of position. But d5 is very solid. I took on d5, and he goes e takes. Knight takes d5 is very possible with the bishop on f4, and here white typically goes bishop g3 and tries to play for e4 here. And it leads to a pretty interesting position, I would say. But ed5, definitely a more classic approach. And here we essentially just get a structure that is the queen's gambit. It's like a Carlsbad if both sides go like e3, c6. But white hasn't really committed a lot of stuff yet other than the bishop to f4. So there's different options here for white. I ended up playing knight c3. I think e3 actually might be a little bit more accurate, just to keep this knight on b1 for the time being. Not that it necessarily doesn't want to go to c3 or that it wants to go to d2, but rather just getting this bishop opened up first and also defending the bishop on f4. So I think this one actually just is a little bit more flexible for white, but I started with knight c3 and now black played c5. So this was kind of surprising for me. This is not really a position I've studied or looked at in any kind of way. So I was already just on my own here and just trying to figure out how to develop my pieces. But I felt like, okay, we're going to get some kind of typical structure, maybe like hanging pawns here for black, or maybe black is going to be left with an isolated queen pawn. And I felt like, okay, it's definitely just a very normal position still. So e3. He decides to take on d4 immediately and clarify the structure. And I think this makes sense. If I take with the pawn, then we have kind of like a symmetrical position, and black is pretty solid. Of course, I was looking for all kinds of like knight b5 ideas, but there's always bishop b4 check, which kind of ruins the fun. So on c takes d4, I end up playing queen takes d4. And it's just to leave black with this weakness on d5. So knight c6, I follow bishop b5. I think this is kind of like the natural approach. And if black plays bishop d7 or something, then I'll just give the bishop and play against the pawn. So knight f3, castles, and kind of use my pieces on the dark squares. Or perhaps black could take with the pawn here and then knight f3, and I think it's a very, very playable position, and black's pawns are always going to be kind of targets for white's pieces. So bishop b5, he just develops naturally bishop e7, which I think is best. Knight f3, castles. Now, of course, my queen is hanging. I could take on c6 right away, but I feel like there's no need because I can also play queen a4 and force black to spend the tempo. And here a6 is not even necessarily coming with a threat because the rook is hanging. So even on e6, I can maybe consider castling in some positions. But yeah, with queen a4, first I attack the knight, and yeah, basically just don't give black that tempo. So here goes queen b6, which again I thought actually was very natural and strong, just defending the knight and putting pressure on b2. I thought for a little bit here and ended up just castling because I just couldn't find a more useful move here. So at this point I was really expecting a6, which I felt like, again, was just a logical follow-up to black's play, where I can't really drop my bishop back because of queen takes b2, and I was looking for a way to sacrifice this pawn, but couldn't really make it work because, of course, I have to spend the tempo defending the knight, and then black will always be able to escape with queen b4 or queen a3, and it seemed like I wasn't getting any kind of compensation here. Queen a3 may be even more accurate to leave the b4 square open for black's knight. So on a6, I would probably just have to take on c6, and then I think black should take with the pawn to keep the queens on the board and keep the pressure against b2. If queen takes c6, then I think white can maybe play for something with like knight a4, rook c1, b3, this kind of classic plan where you just play on all the dark squares and kind of playing against the light square bishop. Feel like a lot of Capablanca games and Rubinstein feature this kind of concept. So this would be very playable for white, but if black just takes with the pawn and tries to use the two bishops, like playing for bishop b7 or bishop b6 and then c5, then I started feeling like black is going to be totally fine in this position. Now it's not so simple. There are some tricks for white. So for example, white has a lot of moves here. Let's say white goes like rook c1, black plays bishop e6, and white plays queen d4 here. If black goes c5, which seems like just a free tempo, then white has knight a4. This is kind of a nice trick. I didn't really know about these kinds of positions. Where we hit the queen on b6, we hit the pawn on c5 as well. And if black takes this one, then we have knight takes b6, hitting the rook, and then we're going to recapture the pawn, and white's just doing extremely well. And there's no rook b8, of course, because of the bishop. So yeah, there are some cool tricks in the position. Of course, here queen takes b2 runs into the classic cheapo, knight takes d5, and then knight takes c7 check, and then getting the queen back with an extra piece. So in the game, I was thinking it's equal, but still, there's always some ideas in the position. Anyway, he ends up going rook to d8, which to me felt logical, like he's just supporting the d pawn and trying to liquidate everything with d4. But yeah, I wasn't sure. It kind of felt like maybe a step in the wrong direction. Because now I go knight e2, and I figured this was the only way to cover d4. Not sure if this was such a great move. The engine was saying knight e4 here was kind of a nice idea for black, maybe trying to play for knight c5. So maybe I should have just done something more natural, the rook c1, but okay, then black I think is able to play d4 in a lot of positions and is going to be absolutely fine. Though there's always lines to look at, like rook c1, d4, bishop takes c6, and so on. It can get very messy. So I'm not really sure what's happening there. dc3 and who knows. So rook d8, knight e2 to cover d4. Now black plays a6. I'm pretty much forced to take on c6, bc, and here I play knight d4. And now I started to feel kind of optimistic because white's knights are starting to jump. Black has the two bishops, of course, but yeah, if all my knights are kind of in the game, it can be very, very annoying. And black does have some weaknesses to defend. So c5 was possible here, and then I was most likely going to go knight c6 and just take on e7. So something like this, and I wasn't sure how to evaluate this position. I think it's probably about equal, but I felt like at least there's always something to play for here with the hanging pawns, and with opposite color bishops, actually, I felt like it gives both sides more dynamic chances. So I kind of felt like this was a playable position. But he ends up going bishop b7, which is a little surprising because it actually allows like knight f5, and white's knights can immediately start getting very annoying. And actually, I probably should have started with this move. I was thinking bishop f8 would be played, and there's some options here like knight e5, knight g5. I'm not sure if these lead anywhere, but bishop g5 is probably the best move. And here we're threatening to take this knight and ruin black's structure. And if black goes c5, white can play queen h4, and actually we get this position in the game, but via a different move order. But this one would be kind of nice for white with a very, very nice initiative. In the game, I started with bishop g5, and my idea here was just that I wanted to play knight f5 anyway and kind of put pressure on this one up front. So black ends up playing c5, and we end up getting the same position here. But I think this one was inaccurate. For one, after c5, knight f5, black could go rook e8 here, and then it's not as bad. Black could also apparently play h6 in this position, to which I was going to play knight f5, but the engine doesn't seem to mind this position for black. But okay, I thought it was kind of an achievement to get this g pawn here, but you know, black goes g4, and maybe it's not such a big deal. But to me, this looked kind of interesting for white anyway, with the knight on f5. So yeah, probably should have started with knight f5, but we do end up getting the same position. So c5, knight f5, he goes bishop f8, queen h4, and I think my opponent just kind of underestimated white's chances here, because I'm actually not just running to take on f6 necessarily. My main threat is knight h6 check, where if black takes the knight, then bishop takes f6, and I'm hitting the rook, and I'm also threatening queen g3, queen g4, which is just mate. So that would just be immediately devastating position. And if knight h6, king h8, then f7 is hanging, and the rook on d8 is also hanging. So black actually has to be extremely careful here, because it's not obvious to see how to deal with this pressure. And if king h8, then okay, maybe he has to watch out for some knight e5 jumps there as well. So he ends up going queen e6, which is the move I was kind of expecting and almost hoping for, although I wasn't really sure how black is supposed to defend. And it looks like it covers f7 nicely, but thankfully white has kind of a nice trick. So knight h6 check. I play this one anyway. If takes, then takes, and this double attack is very, very strong. So king h8 and f7 seems to be covered, but here white again has knight e5, which I was pretty happy to see, because it's kind of a aesthetic trick. Of course, the knight is hanging, but if takes, then there's knight takes f7, picking up the queen. And otherwise, f7 is actually just very, very difficult to defend. The rook doesn't have access to the d7 square, because white can just take it. So yeah, actually, just like that, things end up being very, very difficult for black here. He takes the knight on h6, but bishop takes f6. And now if king moves over, then queen g3 is just game over, so bishop to g7. And here white has a couple of options. Of course, we can just take the rook immediately, but I was also thinking about knight takes f7 check first, because on bishop takes d8, black is going to be taking the knight, so I was thinking maybe it'd be better to get a pawn for it. And then I was thinking, you know, if I don't want to sacrifice the exchange, I could even just trade bishops and play knight to d3. And I felt like this position should be very, very good for white. Even though it's equal material, it looked like black just has so many weaknesses here that it has to be fantastic. But of course, taking a full exchange is kind of hard to pass up. And yeah, I was trying to choose between this position after bishop takes e5 or queen takes e5, and then taking here on f7 first, and then taking like this. I wasn't sure. I thought both are winning, but I realized that the main thing I want to do is play queen e7 and try to force a queen trade. And I realized rather than taking a pawn here first, maybe it's better to just take on d8, so that in the time that it takes black to win back the knight, let's say bishop e5 or queen e5, then I can just immediately play queen e7 and kind of force a queen trade, because I'm just hitting everything in black's position. And then some endgame like this I felt like has to be very, very easy for white, because I'm attacking the pawn. If the pawn advances, we can always kind of neutralize black's dark square bishop, and yeah, no way black is getting enough play for the exchange here. Like, the pawns are super weak. I think the rook should always win here. So yeah, I end up just taking the rook immediately, and my idea is to go for the immediate queen e7. He plays bishop takes e5, queen e7 here. And yeah, I was thinking there's a lot of possible moves for black. So if he takes, then I was quite happy to just recapture and kind of force black to move this pawn, and then I can bring my bishop back and go bishop c3, something like this. Okay, here maybe b2 is hanging. I'm not sure. Maybe I'll drop back here, but I felt it was very nice to kind of fix black's structure. So I didn't think black would trade. I thought black would come up with some other kind of move, like maybe king to g7, and yeah, then white has a choice either to go for the endgame and play something like this, which I thought again was very playable, but at least black has improved their structure somewhat. Or I could take on b7, rook takes, and we could play some middle game like this, which I feel like should be winning for white. I don't think black really has enough compensation here, but you know, it would be a middle game. White would have to definitely still work to convert this position. But to me, it looked quite reasonable for white either way. Then he ends up playing a different move. He goes rook to b8, which yeah, at first glance it caught me off guard because like for some reason I wasn't considering it. And then I realized, okay, it makes a lot of sense now. Like he defends the bishop, and so I can't go queen b7, of course. And if I go for this endgame with this one, then actually at some point he might be threatening to take this pawn. So something like c4, bishop c5, he could like take here, and since the bishop on b7 is defended, he can kind of go into this one. Yeah, and then I mean, I don't know, the whole thing, it took like 30 seconds. Then I realized like oh wait, I just have this one, which I had already seen before, and then I played it and we shook hands. But it was kind of funny because like when he played rook b8, I didn't immediately remember. But when I was thinking about this whole thing, like from back here, basically, I'd already seen like, you know, if I take queen e7, I'm forcing this one. That's why I thought king g7 was like a candidate move, right? I thought like, okay, maybe king g7, and then if I take, he can improve his structure and so on. So when you play rook b8, it's like, oh, I didn't consider this move. And then it took me a second to kind of readjust. You know, it was a long tournament, guys. You know, it was a long tournament. It happens. I've definitely blundered a mate that I didn't expect over the board. That's definitely happened to me. So what can you do? But I was happy to get the win. You know, I felt like I put some pressure on the opponent and found some nice tricks. Of course, definitely black could have defended better, but yeah, that's how it goes sometimes at the end of the tournament. You know, players get tired and people miss stuff. And I definitely feel like I was kind of missing stuff in the game as well. I didn't even immediately see the mate. Like, it took me like 30 seconds before I recognized like what just happened. So yeah, long event. So right, with this one, I finished with 6 points out of 9, which I think was a very decent result. The performance rating was something like 25-14 FIDE, which is pretty good. I still felt like I could have played better in a lot of games. I also felt like I got a little lucky in some games. So yeah, I don't know. Life goes on. Chess is still fun to play and analyze and explore. And I got the Vegas tournament coming up that's starting literally tomorrow, the time of recording.